Hello, and welcome to the Casey Undercover reading series, my trilogy in progress. Before we step into the next chapter, a word about why I'm releasing this series the way I am. Casey Undercover isn't being quietly written in isolation and then handed off fully formed. It's unfolding here in real time because stories about institutional pressure, exile, and the cost of truth deserves time to unfold, especially in today's world. This series follows Casey at the moment her career fractures. She didn't collapse. She didn't confess. She just went too far into a story, and the consequences were devastating. She lost status, stability, reputation. What she didn't lose was the instinct that told her when something was very wrong. As we arrive in Wallamalsink in Chapter 3, Casey has been professionally erased. Assignments have dried up. Eye contact has shortened, and the adrenaline pulse that used to drive her work has been replaced by disillusionment and distance. She's in self-imposed exile now, in a town no one has ever heard of, Wallamalsink. It's slower, quieter here, almost deceptively benign. But Casey doesn't experience it as retreat. The instincts that got her into trouble have not disappeared. Here, her conundrum only grows because beneath the town's surface, something is brewing, something that sets her instincts on fire. So, a note just before we start. So the two chapters I've read so far, I now believe belong, in the prologue, and that the real story begins here. So tell me what you think. Thanks, and here we go, Chapter 3. And I should mention, sorry, that the first book in the trilogy is called Redacted. So, Chapter 3 of Redacted. Things like time are of little consequence in a town that seems perpetually lodged between the past and an unsettling present. Woollamulsink is a place of whispering trees and crumbling histories, a town where everyone knows your business, except, of course, the bits they've deliberately chosen to forget. It is here, at the edge of the Delaware River, that I, Casey Layton, once a formidable journalist with a nose for unraveling hidden truths, has exiled herself. It seems that the esteemed Miss Layton has chosen to swap the bright, scandalous world of investigative reporting for the civilized monotony of library work, preferring to live among dead authors than dead newsrooms. But fate, or something more insidious, has had other plans. Okay, great. Granted, my life is not a sweeping epic, but the drama sometimes gets away from me. So I now mentally scrap the prelude to my imagined cautionary tale. But really, I am here living in a town that time and all sense of style has seemed to forget, known as Place of Peace by the local Lenape, who 200 years or so ago were pushed off their territorial ground by white imperialists. It is where the infamous Harper Leighton Wynne and Julian Leighton Wynne raised their precocious daughter, Cassandra Leighton Wynne, who would eventually return as disgraced former journalist Casey Layton. I squint in the morning light and adjust my once sensational $400 sweater before stepping into the town library. Yes, the sweater really was $400 before I bought it at a sample sale for a mere 20, then wore it until the seams gave up and a dry cleaner started suggesting I buy no clothes. New York was great for finding those sorts of deals. I believed in looking good because it upped the response quality of whomever you were dealing with at the time, whether it was a retiree selling hammers at Home Depot or a CEO of a Fortune 500 company from which he had embezzled millions. But these days, I felt as worn as the sweater. The little brick building sits at the edge of the nearly forgotten crossroads where New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey collide. A hinterland haven for the failed cast-offs of urban ambition. The Delaware River gleams in the distance, its glassy surface the one thing in my life that has never felt tarnished. I pull the door shut behind me, the jingle of the library bell echoing in the stillness. Inside, the library smells faintly of mildewed paper and something else I can't quite place, a scent I've come to associate with safety and self imposed exile. I place my bag behind the circulation desk and glance at my watch. 10 minutes to spare. I need the job, need the money. My mortgage on my little cottage isn't going to pay itself. I'd found that this place was only too glad to hire someone literate and capable and not at all interested in on her failed writing career. Now here I am, the town's latest librarian, scraping by, being buoyed by the sight of faded book covers and the occasional brown bear sauntering past the window. It isn't a terrible life, but it isn't the one I'd nearly killed myself over trying to attain. Maybe that isn't such a bad thing. Miss Layton, comes a voice as grating as fresh sandpaper. The diminutive Eleanor Nell Whitaker approaches with the hasty precision of a woman who believes the world ought to move at her pace, and that any deviation from this law is not just an inconvenience, but a personal affront. Her double knit pant legs, pressed to a mathematically crisp degree, softly swish against one another as she walks, while her bold polka-dotted blouse topped by a big fluffy bow suggests she either lost a bet or is conducting some kind of social experiment involving the mainstreaming of circus wear. The institution gray of the library walls enhances the effect, making her seem like a timeless relic of book collections past, something built into the foundation, installed generations ago along with the microfiche machines and the strict disdain for nonsense. Her black bob, streaked with dignified strands of silver, is pinned back with a no-nonsense headband, and her oversized yellow plastic jewelry gleams with the unapologetic defiance of someone who has worn the same thing for decades and sees no reason to stop now. Her bracelet clacks as she moves her arm, the sound oddly reminiscent of a warning rattle. Completing the ensemble is a pair of sensible low-heeled vinyl pumps, taupe, of course, because why introduce excitement when a mixture of brown and beige will do? They click against the floor in an even, no-nonsense rhythm, a telltale percussion of something preparing for the right moment to strike. I wonder, as I always do, whether the entire persona is an elaborate act, whether beneath the facade of public sector ordinariness, she has a collection of $700 suits folded away in the back of her closet. The act is just too perfect, the haughtiness too practiced, the sheer commitment to the role just too unwavering. If Nell Whitaker were a magician, this is the part where she'd bow with a flourish, just before revealing she's already picked your pocket, rewritten the bylaws of your existence, and rearranged the library's funding structure while you weren't looking. She is that efficient. "Morning, Miss Whitaker," I say with a thin smile, wondering if she calls herself polka-dotted Viper of the Stacks like I do in my head. "You're late," Nell replies, even though I'm not. "I expect the periodical section to be sorted before lunch. We can't have the patrons thinking this place is slipshod." "Spit and polish patrol on its way," I mutter dutifully, earning a pointed look from Nell. "Excuse me?" "Nothing. I'll take care of it." The dark lady of ye polka dots stares at me for a beat too long, as if deciding whether or not to point out something else wrong with me. I meet her gaze briefly, my helpful response bouncing on my tongue like a sucked-on lifesaver. What about some subdued lighting and personal recommendations from the staff, huh? The library could use some warmth, some individuality, maybe a couch and some pillows. But no. I've been certain the community would respond well to a wall of curated book suggestions. Wouldn't it be fascinating to see what the third grade teacher loved to read as a child, or which romance novel the police chief secretly devoured? I wonder. But the memory of my attempt at such a suggestion freezes my words in my throat. It all started innocently, me proposing a new display near the circulation desk, a local history books, a display of local history books paired with personal anecdotes from residents. I'd even spoken to a few regular patrons, and their stories were delightful. Mrs. Barnett from down the road had lent her copy of Little Woman, the one her mother had read to her during long winters. Mr. Clay, the retired train conductor, had a first edition of Atlas Shrugged, dog-eared and heavily notated. It's community building, I'd said. It makes the library feel like it belongs to the people. And for a little while, my plan worked. The stories these patrons shared were warm and comforting, like soft light filtering through the cracks of my otherwise hardened life. Mrs. Barnett spoke about how her mother's reading voice could transform even the bleakest day into something magical. Mr. Clay recounted the long, solitary nights in his conductor's cabin, where Anne Rand's ideological, sledgehammer's subtle, those are my words, prose kept him company. Their tales weren't just charming, they were human. So human, in fact, that I found myself smiling more than I had in years, their warmth seeping into my carefully guarded cynicism. For the first time in what feels like forever, the relentless drive to ferret out lies, to expose the rot beneath the surface, had seemed to dull. It was almost nice, this quiet life. No snarling editors, no brash accusations, no tangled webs of corruption that left me questioning everything. There were no whistleblowers to protect, no faceless enemies plotting in boardrooms. Here, it's just deer under the pines. Fergus, the groundhog, or was he a gopher, waddling through my yard, and the chatter of locals recounting stories of old. I tell myself maybe this is enough. Maybe I can accept a placid life in the country. It certainly would be a change. No more chasing scandals, no more waking up in a cold sweat wondering if I'd gone too far, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I can just be. I can plant a garden. I can bake cookies and try to remember how to read for pleasure instead of for answers. It's a fantasy I had been entertaining lately, and more often than I'd like to admit. I even bought baking sheets. And yet, deep down, I knew better. I'm not the kind of person who can fade into the background, who can find lasting contentment in a life of stasis. For all the warmth and peace these stories bring, they leave a nagging itch. They remind me of the power stories hold, not just to comfort, but to reveal, to change, to provoke, and that's a pull of gravity I am simply unable to ignore. The thought hangs there, heavy and unwelcome. You're hiding, Casey. I push it aside. No, I tell myself, this is self-preservation, a reprieve. I deserve that much after everything, don't I? I glance at the new display near the circulation desk, where Mrs. Barnett's faded Little Women sits next to Mr. Clay's battered Atlas Shrugged. The handwritten anecdotes I'd faithfully transcribed from their stories are pinned up beside them. I smile faintly. Maybe I can let myself believe this is enough for now, at least until something forces me to remember who I really am and what I really want. But hell hath no fury like a lead librarian in plastic adornment, or who hadn't come up with the idea first. Nell had paused as she saw the display, her expression unreadable, her face nearly matching the bright red, perfectly manicured hands that clasped her clipboard so tightly her fingers turned white. She scanned the display, her wide, scandalized eyes and twitching lips contributing to the grievous signs that an opinion was forthcoming. I braced myself. In a tone that could curdle milk, and really it could, she said, "This is a library, Miss Layton, not a kindergarten scrapbooking club." I blinked, stunned by the dismissal, even though I'd seen it coming. I admit it. She had a first-rate, sometimes even sought-after interviewer feeling like she'd just learned that Charles Darwin. Let me try that line again. I blinked, stunned by the dismissal, even though I'd seen it coming. I admit it. She had a first-rate, sometimes even sought-after interviewer, feeling like she'd just learned that Charles Darwin hadn't written The Origin of the Species, and that it was actually part of a social experiment to make people feel they had no free will. Well, that is a true story, but I'll save that for another time. I stammered, but books are meant to be borrowed, not over-sentimentalized," Nell interrupted, each word clipped as though she were reeling off a policy memo. If you have time to indulge in such projects, I suggest you use it to complete the catalog digitalization you so brashly pushed for." I swallowed hard at this, feeling the weight of my insistence pressing down on me like a stack of tomes. I had stupidly argued for modernization, believing naively that progress beyond the year of 1959 could exist in a place like this. Now, the endless, soulless task stretched before me, an ocean of metadata and monotony threatening to swallow up every spark of life that hadn't yet been stamped out of me. How could I have been so ghastly short-sighted and enthusiastic? Rows upon rows of ISBNs devoid of titles marched endlessly across the database. No stories, no voices, just barcodes and system logs, each keystroke a quiet act of suicide by boredom. Nell's words landed like a slap, echoing in the quiet library. I opened my mouth to argue, to explain why the display mattered as much, if not more, than moving the library into the 20th, if not the 21st century. But Nell had turned away, tiny, indefensible heels already clicking away, most likely heading off to record my crime of non-essential enthusiasm. For a moment I stood there staring at the display I'd spent hours assembling. The carefully arranged books, the handwritten anecdotes, the photos I'd scanned and printed to accompany the stories. Suddenly, it all seemed absurdly childish in light of Nell's rejection. It wasn't just that the project had been dismissed, it was the way it had been dismissed, like suggesting a library should foster community was akin to reading poetry at a board meeting, a suggestion meeting with polite nods before being fed into the shredder of policy and protocol. What had I been thinking? Quietly, almost mechanically, I disassembled the display. I stacked the books into neat piles, carefully removing the anecdotes I'd pinned to the bulletin board. My fingers trembled as I worked, a mix of anger and self-righteous and self-righteous, willful ignorance tightening my throat, to quote my mom. Well, she wasn't really her mom. She didn't really call her her mom. To quote Harper. And just like that, the spark snuffs out. I retreat. I comply. I shrink down into some new version of myself that knows better than to fight a battle already lost. Ooh, sorry. Into some new version of myself that now knows better than to fight a battle already lost. I exhale sharply, pressing the frustration down where it can't escape, where it won't betray me. This is a lesson I should have learned. I am an extension of the system, a function to be performed. No deviation, no creativity, no attempts to remind anyone that books exist not just to be shelved, but to be lived in. The next morning, Mrs. Barnett arrives, eyes bright with the kind of warmth that makes my stomach sink before she speaks. I brought another book to add, Anne of Green Gables. My mother always said it. I reminded her of Anne, you know. I swallowed around the knot in my throat and forced the words out. That's wonderful, Mrs. Barnett, but I hesitate because I hate this part, because I know how it will end. We've had to take the display down. Library policy. Her smile flickers. Her fingers tighten around the book's spine. Oh, I see. I should say something else. I should explain, but what good would it do? The damage is done. Mrs. Barnett, Mr. Clay, the others, the ones who had eagerly shared their stories, who had believed this library could be more than just a revolving door of borrowed books and overdue notices, all came looking for the display, for their words pinned carefully to the board, for proof that they mattered. What was I supposed to tell them? That their stories weren't professional enough, that sentimentality doesn't fit with Eleanor the Robot Queen's sterile version of what a town-funded space should be. That connection. I'm sorry, that should be Nell, the Robot Queen. That connection, community, and belonging are clutter in the margins of perfectly ordered policies. By the time I finish dismantling it all, the circulation desk is as barren as before, as if nothing had ever been there to begin with. It's not just the display that's been erased, it's the fragile tether I had begun to weave between these walls and the people who find solace in them. It's the stink of purpose that for a moment had erroneously made me feel like I wasn't just passing time, wasn't just filling space. At times my gullibility shocks even me. The library moves on, as it always does, slipping back into its usual rhythm. Books in, books out, everything running smoothly, efficiently, properly. But for me, something is off kilter. I feel it in the way my work no longer satisfies, in the way I catch myself staring at empty spaces where stories should be. The display had been more than just a side project. It had been a pulse, a heartbeat, a quiet rebellion. Okay, so I'm feeling this chapter is going on too long about this sole subject. There are a couple of more paragraphs. There's too much wallowing in the past. I think I need to move this forward into the next event and start with the introduction of a new character here, which does come later on in the next chapter, but I'm thinking she needs to come in here, and she is going to change the mood of everything and start the dynamic rolling. And this is a perky, very annoyingly adorable voice from Casey's past. Okay, I'm going to stop here for now. Thank you for joining, and please do leave your comments. Bye now.